So women have been at the forefront, I think, of the mental health revolution and awareness, and there's no better person than Dr. Pratima Murthy here to enlighten us about what's happening in this spectrum. I'll just briefly introduce Dr. Pratima Murthy. She is presently the Director and Senior Professor of Psychiatry at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, popularly known as NIMHANS in Bangalore. She's a prolific author. She has more than 300 research publications in index journals and scientific books to her credit. And for all the recognition that she's earned in research, she has received numerous awards and honors, including the Lifetime Achievement Award from Rotary and the Dr. Raja Ramana State Award by the Government of Karnataka. Please extend a warm welcome to Dr. Pratima Murthy.
Thank you.
So Dr. Murthy, I think because we are here at the India Today Women's Summit on Gender Equity, first thing I'd like to start off with is, there's been a lot of conversation recently about gender differences and their impact on mental health. Can you please elaborate that, especially from an Indian perspective? Do you see that? Are women particularly the targets of mental health more, and perhaps coming up more and not saying it? What do you see is happening in that spectrum? Yeah.
I just wanted to start off by saying this was introduced as a fireside chat. It's rather cold here. I would actually like a fireplace. So let me start answering your question by actually taking off where Raj left off. And I think that speaks, some of the numbers that he mentioned actually speaks for why women at this point are more vulnerable to mental health problems. Merely a lot of it is explained by the socio-cultural context, the disadvantages that women suffer, the lack of opportunities that they suffer, the expectation of women as being able to handle several things at the same time, lack of equal opportunity maybe at the workplace. So a lot of these early marriage, so a lot of these are the social determinants, if you will, of mental disorders. Then of course, when you look at common mental disorders like depression and anxiety, because of a lot of these vulnerabilities and this exposure to stress, women are naturally more likely to have common mental disorders. When you talk about severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar mood disorder, and so on, they are more gender equitable, which means that the biology perhaps, kind of confers the same kind of risks to both men and women. But if you look at access to treatment, the delays in getting treated, outcomes from disorders, women are again more disadvantaged. And of course, when you look at perhaps the biological construct, the physiological construct, women tend to be more internalizers, which means they are more likely, to keep things to themselves, to not easily express things. Men tend to be more externalizers. They are more, socially, aggressive, perhaps. Substance use is more common usually among men. So that's another pattern. So a lot of these things, so people talk about the genetics and the familial risk. They talk about the exposome or the environment where there might be, for example, we also spoke about domestic violence. So many of those disadvantages that women may face, the physiological differences that particularly women during childbirth or during menstrual cycles may actually have hormonal differences which make them more vulnerable. And of course, in these support systems, one of the things that's always struck me is that I work in a field of mental health and addictions. When there is a man with a problem, there are several family members who come with the person. But when a woman comes into treatment, there's very little social support that comes with it. So some of these things together kind of really determine. So now there's something called the environmentome, which is basically the larger environment. And that's where we need to look at policies, we need to look at programs that actually help women attain an equitable and a fair playing field.
Noted, ma'am. I'm going to quickly run through you a survey that was done in 2023 titled Women at Work by Deloitte. And it was done across 10 countries. And it showed that the stress levels of Indian working women were relatively higher than in any of the other countries. And I mean, they identified many factors, but clearly you're seeing a pattern where women experience more stress than their male counterparts at work. What do you think are the reasons for such findings? What are perhaps the workspaces not accounting for when they are trying to achieve gender parity, but perhaps they're not taking into account that women are highly susceptible?
So in fact, there's a recent meta-analysis, which is really an evaluation of all the research in the area, just 2023, which actually suggests that the findings as in terms of gender and work stress are fairly inconsistent. But given that area, I think it's very important to understand that, I mean, there's a very nice saying. I was working with the International Labour Organization on workplace prevention of mental health problems and substance use. It says whenever a worker goes into work, they don't leave their problems behind. So, whatever may be the problems that you have in the community, in your family, etc., it's very difficult to kind of disengage from that and completely concentrate on your work. Similarly, when there is a lot of stress at work and you go home, there is a tendency to take that. And nowadays, the digital space has made the work-home boundaries so diffuse that you're practically on the job 24/7, at least, and your entire working hours. In addition to that, there are several things, for example, like control over your speed of work, control over how much work you need to do, autonomy in the workplace, time in the workplace. And a lot of these things are, again, going back to the introductory comments that we heard, when you don't have that much autonomy, when you don't have that much control, and when you're not financially compensated adequately, all of this can be important areas of stress. The other thing is support at the workplace. For example, having a creche at the workplace where you can leave a child and be comfortable in the fact that the child is looked after well. Women have the additional burden of not only looking after the children, but usually the elders in the family as well. I mean, I don't want to call it a burden. I don't think it's fair to call it a burden, but it's true practically that, they have the additional responsibility of taking care of several other things. So this kind of expectation that, you're going to balance everything together is a little unrealistic.
Yeah, like it's almost expected that the work-life balance when it comes to, family, you have to cook, you have to clean, you have to take care of the child. All of this a woman has to deal with, right? Yeah.
Although I must say that at least in urban India, there is a greater awareness of the need to have these responsibilities a little bit more equitably distributed, and you'll find that small things like this actually creates a difference. The expectation that, young boys and young girls also ought to share in family chores, for example, rather than believe that only the girl has to take care of all the responsibilities at home. I think these are very important.
I'm just going to factor this in because you mentioned about a creche. There's also recent talk about menstrual leave, and you brought up, menstrual condition can also. What are your opinions on that? Because there are certain companies like Zomato which are implementing it. Where do you stand on that?
Again, I think it depends on different people. There are a lot of people for whom it may not be an issue. But there might be people who suffer severe premenstrual syndromes, and I think for them these are very important issues. So rather than look at it as a blanket, I think it's important to look at it. So for example, on the other side, you have paternity leave, which is now granted to men, because men equally need to participate in the arrival of a child at home. So I think net, we're looking at more equitable and supportive, environments where whether it's women, men, depending upon their needs, there are certain concessions that are made. I think that's where we need to go.
I think a follow-up to this would be, what can women do with high-flying careers to develop that psychological resilience? Is there a magic potion that you can share with us? That how do we sort of get that balance?
That feels like Superman or Superwoman. You take a swig of the magic potion and everything is hunky-dory. Not at all. I'm sure we can talk to several of the women achievers you have lined up today who will give you a lot of tips on how to do it.
And I must tell you, when I was working on the Sheila story, a lot of the people who we profiled in it spoke about mental health as well, that it's not just physical well-being, but mental health being as well.
So I think that's very critical. Again, go back to the introductory comments this morning on how women in leadership roles can be very transformational in the way they perform their leadership roles. So I think being inclusive, getting more people on board, working in teams, sharing success, being empathetic are all ways in which women not only help others but also help themselves in a work environment. The second thing, of course, is I think reasonable time management, reasonable prioritization. That's also very critical. At the end of the day, it's also about having good support systems at home, at the workplace, and of course, having ways of unwinding. I think these are some of the simple things that I can straight away think of.
I want to know, what does Dr. Murthy do to unwind in Bangalore?
Let me say what I enjoy is my little trips out. So even this is, for example, a 4-hour outing from my routine. That helps me. So I love travel. Spending a little time to myself. I don't call it me time, but just some kind of quiet time is very, very useful. Any chance to be out in a garden or out in nature is something I really enjoy. And the occasional, of course, Netflix. Just watch about just about everything. So that keeps me.
Okay.
And spending time with my family.
Family? Netflix, you're a Netflix binger, huh? Do you like binge watching? Not that
I don't
much.
have the time to binge watch, but I certainly watch.
Great. We were talking about mental health, and generally there is this idea that there is a stigma attached to talk about it. Like, can you actually say you have an anxiety disorder? The hiring of people with bipolar disorders, or just people who are experiencing mental health ailments. And I think I quote you here, you said that there's an assumption that we need to be in control of our mental state 100% of the time. How do you see these misconceptions and attitudes in the current environment, especially when you have the Prime Minister during Mann Ki Baat specifically bringing up topics of mental health? Is there a wave of change happening on that front, or are we still sort of, as you said, people who just internalize it and not express it?
Yeah, so I think there's an expectation that if you're happy, if you have to be happy, it means that you can't have any negative moments. I mean, that's simply not the case. Everybody has their ups and downs, and people who are generally mentally well also have their ups and downs, but it's just that they possibly train themselves to come back to the middle and to be more centered even when these things happen. So there are several other misconceptions about mental illness. That one thing is this. The second thing is that, it's wrong to talk about your mental state, that you have to be in control of it all the time. If it's a headache, you can talk about it, but if it's an anxiety, you can't talk about it. I mean, that's a kind of dichotomy we create between physical symptoms and mental symptoms. So I think it's important. We have a brain inside our head, and the brain is an organ just like the liver and the heart and the kidney and everything else. So when things go wrong, maybe when things in the environment affect your brain, you do get stressed, and therefore it's important to recognize that, but also know how to deal with it effectively. That's important. The other thing, of course, is that, one must always be in control of oneself. It's a sign of weakness to have any kind of mental symptoms. Again, the fact is that just like physical symptoms occur, mental symptoms can occur. There is enough literature to suggest that whether it's, eating disorders, whether it's depression or anxiety, there are chemical changes that occur in the brain. So, and typical examples also are, for example, as to why women have premenstrual symptoms. That's not because they are weak. It's because they have certain, types of constitution which makes them more vulnerable to these things. So understanding that is very critical. So similarly, getting help. That it's a stigma, and that's the stigma that you talked about. Acknowledging or accepting that one has a mental disorder, talking about a mental disorder, seeking help for a mental disorder are all in society stigmatized. Sadly enough, we stigmatize these important areas where help is available and people can get better, and society somewhere along the line, is more normalizes, let's say, the use of substances. So I think we have it wrong somewhere, and constantly the society needs to reorient ourselves to what really is a priority, and acknowledging mental health symptoms, seeking help certainly is a priority.
And I'll say that I think women sort of have been at the forefront of talking about it. We've had Deepika Padukone come forth and say that when she was perhaps experiencing the best professional high of her career, said that I was battling depression. You've had Amir Khan's daughter, Ira Khan, who is leading a mental health initiative. Would it be fair to say, ma'am, that there is now just general greater awareness about mental health awareness, and especially post-pandemic, when we began to hear words during pandemic such as we had this fear-odemic, you had anxiety, you had stress, you had isolation. Have you seen that shift happen, that generally now people are like, yeah, or is it more flippantly used, like, oh, I'm going through anxiety, but maybe you are not. You hear of panic attacks. So is there more greater awareness of mental health overall?
I think generally there has been a greater awareness, and COVID certainly, has both led to an increase in what are called common mental disorders like depression and anxiety, but also I think made it more acceptable for people, A, to acknowledge it, and B, to try and reach out. And I think it's very, very important that people who are influencers in society also talk about these issues so that it's seen as more acceptable to get help, clearly. But it's also important to have the help available. If I have distress, if I don't know where to go to help and help is not available, that creates a problem too. And therefore, I think also creating opportunities for people to get help confidentially, and that's where technology helps. That, there are ways of reaching out to mental health care professionals. We have something called the Telemanas, which again was introduced by the Government of India in October of the previous year. And in 1.5 years, we've had more than 6 lakh calls that have been serviced for sleep disturbances, exam anxiety, depression, interpersonal difficulties. So I think the fact that people can be helped with psychological problems which are not necessarily mental disorders. So I think that understanding is very important. Most people like you and me, we're okay in terms of managing, but when the stress becomes too much, when we have things happening one after another, when we are vulnerable, there might be times in life where we need a little help. And, and we manage that, and then we're okay on our own. So I think having that kind of help in society is also very important.
Will you elaborate on this? Can you tell me a little bit about some of the helplines that are available? Because not everybody can perhaps go to a shrink. What are some of the things that are there, perhaps we are not aware in public. A lot of people actually go online and start looking for, online counseling sessions also became sort of a huge thing during COVID. So is there a lot of more, opportunities out there to address it?
So 14416 is one number that I'd like to share, because that's a Telemanas number, and that's available practically in every state, in every union territory, as the Telemanas cell, which allows people to just talk about what they want and provides them with one level of counseling, but also recognizes that if they have a more severe problem, that they can see a mental health care professional or go to thing. Similarly, many states have various other kinds of helplines. They have women's helplines, there are suicide helplines. Sneha in Chennai runs a very, very important helpline for people who are feeling that they don't want to live anymore in their life. So there are several other helplines like these which are trying to reach out to people. NGOs also have helplines which are trying to reach out to people. But the important thing is, I think, is that people must never feel that there is no help available. They must not be in a situation where they feel helpless and hopeless, because always, one of the things I always tell people is, even when all the doors seem closed, there will always be a window open. And trying to find that, helping people being able to find that, their feeling that, life is not worth living, or there is, it's futile, is something that we again must not make normal. We need to denormalize this kind of feeling that, people oughtn't to live, because every life is precious, and we need to support people to, get over and get back and get forward.
While we're talking about this, I'm just very curious, because we're talking about gender equity. What is it like at NIMHANS and personally for you when you were pursuing a career in psychiatry, and there's neurosurgery there as well? How was it in the gender ratio? Were you one of the few girls in the classes, or was there gender parity there? And yeah, what is it like? Is your workforce staff divided between men and women? Tell me a little bit about that, ma'am.
So when I started seems like a long time ago, in 1985, in the mid-80s, we were just 2 girls in a class of, about 12 or 14 guys. But now I can tell you the number of women residents who come is 50-50. In neurosurgery, for a long time, for almost 2 or 3 decades, there was 1 neurosurgery faculty in our institution. Now we have 5 women residents, in pursuing their MCH in neurosurgery. All the 3 deans in my institution are women.
Wow, I think that merits a applause. 3 deans are women.
All the 3 deans are women. But while I say that with a great amount of pride, equally one is aware that there are, other places that we talked about earlier where there is a lot of inequity. But what I wanted to point out is that it's actually important to make those conscious changes because women in leadership positions have been shown to have certain advantages. I mentioned the transformational leadership styles, the more inclusive, empathetic styles. So I think there's a great value actually that companies should recognize in having more women in leadership positions.
That's great.
And nobody's come there because of their gender. They've
Absolutely.
come there because of their abilities.
Absolutely.
And that shouldn't be forgotten.
Yeah, totally. We have a lot of young people in the audience here and it's a generation of likes, as I call it, on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, now called X. What would you want to tell? And we are seeing a whole gamut of sort of issues that are emerging because of social media. We speak about body image disorders. Right now, as we speak, the big CEOs in California are being taken to task by the parents of kids, for saying that the platform is completely unhealthy for them, that you're not taking care of them, you're exposing them to dangerous groups and individuals. How do you see, in this age of social media, mental health seeping in and the relevance of it?
This is a bit like a chicken and egg situation because, what comes first, what vitiates the other, can be debated endlessly. But I think there's certainly more angst in the millennials or Gen Z, whatever you call it now. What's the latest?
Gen Z only. Gen Z. Most
still?
of them are Gen Z.
I know. I'm updated till Gen Z. I don't know what's after that. But I think certainly there's more angst. There's some things are great. Adolescence is an absolutely wonderful time where there's so much opportunity, so much passion, so much interest in pursuing things. But equally, I think there is a great sense of maybe even a loss of confidence. Worry about what might happen. A sense of, where am I going, asking myself this. So I think there's been a couple of decades where young people have been, in this kind of turmoil. And I think while social media is a great game changer, it's done so much, given so many opportunities, done so many things for us, it's also a place where, it kind of perhaps, multiplies this sense of competitiveness or comparison, if you will.
And even image, isn't it?
And image building and so on. So those can be fairly detrimental, particularly to vulnerable people. And therefore, I think it's important to use social media wisely for the things it helps to do. But at the same time, never forget that social connectedness is very critical. Community senses is very critical because that's, in some ways, what's kept us alive as a society, what's kept us growing as a society is the sense of we. And to lose that in an isolated world, it's so funny, isn't it? It's ironic that in a community where you might be connected to 2,000 users, at the end of the day, you're a very lonely person. And that's why it's very important to try and engage in more social relationships and use the social media for what it's intended to do.
But you must be hearing cases of people coming up with social
media
addiction.
Excessive use of social media, dropping their grades, becoming so lonely and isolated, having severe anxiety, not being able to stop watching it, losing opportunities at work. Several problems arise as a consequence of excessive social media use and addiction. And we're seeing that. Social media is one aspect of it. There is also the online gambling. So we're seeing lots more cases of gambling addiction, people losing entire fortunes and coming in, sexual pornography addiction, shopping addiction. In fact, I
Yes.
remember this.
I think a lot of women here will identify with that.
So, in fact, I had a lawyer's wife, who came in. She had spent lakhs and lakhs and lakhs of rupees, and that emanated out of the anxiety of not being able to fulfill her roles at home, some obsessional symptoms, and she would hoard colors of the same sari, 20, saris of the same color, matching shoes. I mean, so it's when the opportunity to buy things online kind of translates into an addiction and then becomes a problem. So that transition is something that we all must be aware of.
Ladies, now you know where to call and who to call once you're battling this addiction. Ma'am, we're talking about addiction. I've been told that your area of specialization is actually addiction. Your thesis was on that. Can you tell me a little bit about the work you're doing on that front? And how's that on the gender way? Is it more men tilted when it comes to addiction and substance abuse, or are you seeing a change in that front?
So when I talked about externalizing symptoms earlier, that is aggression, disinhibition, and substance use, traditionally it's been more common amongst men. In fact, a lot of services also have been men-centered. Research has also been male-centered in this area because you didn't think that there was a possibility. But over time, we're seeing that with more women, using substances, the addiction among women is also increased. We have something that's called telescoping that occurs among women. They may start the use of substances a little later, but very quickly they develop addiction. They're likely to develop many more systemic damage because particularly, for example, with alcohol, the body tends to retain the alcohol much longer. Neurological damage, again, is more conspicuous with women as compared to men. It occurs faster. A lot of women tend to use, amongst the people we've seen using substances, many of them, particularly those that use sedatives, are to calm down their anxiety or to improve their mood. And that's why it's very important, not simply to say you ban all substances, but really to teach people how to cope better, how to be more resilient, as you were asking, how to look after their own mental state so that they don't need to turn to substances of abuse to change their mood state. That's very important.
It's a misconception to think that it's only men.
And earlier we did not have a ward separately for women. And one of my women patients told me it's impossible for me to stay, in the general kind of situation. So in fact, it's when we got this kind of feedback that we started a separate ward. Not a happy moment, but I think it was necessary to do that to help.
So when was this ward established? I'm curious.
This was about 2005.
Wow. So now there is a separate ward for women on that front.
Yeah.
That's good. Ma'am, just
2015 actually.
15, okay. The National Mental Health Survey of 2016 showed that 150 million Indians needed mental health care, but only 30 million could access it. Now, we know that the new version of the survey is underway. How would you view the current mental health state of the country? And especially, I know it's an ongoing process, but NIMHANS is obviously involved in it.
Yeah.
Is the access easier? Have the numbers come down? What is your understanding of it?
So, roughly 1 in 10 of us has a diagnosable mental disorder. 1 in 10. And for every 1 in 10 persons who have a diagnosable mental disorders, there are probably 6 to 8 times the number of people who are experiencing some kind of psychological distress. So in terms of numbers, it's huge. But we also want to see not just the problem, but the responses to the problem. And that's why in the mental health survey, the second one, we're looking at the systems that are available in the states and union territories, how responsive these symptoms are, how many people are being seen in medical colleges, in different hospitals and so on. What about vulnerable populations, people in prisons, people in correctional centers, women particularly, minority communities. We're looking at some of those issues as well, and vulnerable communities. We're also looking to see where we need to ramp up the services much more and have a network of services so that nobody slips through the system. Suicide prevention is yet another very, very important area that we've taken up. There is a policy on suicide prevention which we also need to take up.
We have only 30 seconds left, so this is the best time to ask Dr. Murthy, you know, when it comes to physical health, there is the world out there to tell you what to do and what not to do, right? Whether it's nutrition, whether it's working out. I wanted to know, what tips would you share with the audience here who want to sort of keep their mental health under check? I mean, just basic, what would you tell the audience? Because there is no medicine that can, you know, quick fix it. So what are things that we can do in our day-to-day life?
You know, when I was a little low, I was reading something and I read this. It says, I wish I was a glowworm. A glowworm's never glum. You can hardly be downhearted if you have light shining through your bum. Now, I wish we were like glowworms. Unfortunately, we are not. So first, accept that ups and downs are part of our existence. The second thing is, learn to look after yourself. Self-care is the most important as far as mental health is concerned. Which means your thoughts, your feelings, your behavior, introspection about it, and changing the things that you can change reasonably, very important. Relaxing the mind, just like you physical exercise is very important for the mind. A good diet is very important for the mind. Some degree of relaxation, whether it's through mindfulness, whether it's through yoga, whether it's through taking a walk, whether it's through learning music, very important. Having some kind of stress busters, as you mentioned earlier. Whether, again, we have Madam here, you know, music is an amazing stress buster, as are so many other things. So I'm sure all the other leaders will also give tips on that. So I think, and be compassionate to yourself. We're always very critical. We're always investing in negative symptoms, you know, in negative things, like feeling critical of everybody else, guilty about. Let negative emotions go to the extent possible. Be grateful for what you have. And of course, be passionate, be motivated. That's also very important. Get social support. Get families to support you. Support themselves. Nothing happens. It's always a quid pro quo. The more you give, the more you get. So be a little altruistic in society. You will be better off. And of course, if there is distress, reach out. You can reach out informally to people around you. Develop a network of friends. That doesn't work. Make sure you reach out for professional help. So doing all this, we can be mentally healthy and we can take care of people with mental problems.
That's very good advice. And the good thing about me moderating the session is I can reach out to Dr. Murthy. I don't know about all of you, but I can definitely reach out to you, ma'am, for help. Thank you so much for taking the time out. I know you have a lot of work going on at NIMHANS in Bangalore, so really appreciate it. Everyone, Dr. Pratima Murthy.